Great, that should be working.
Great. Lovely to see so many here this late. And great to be in this panel. The thing about presenting on the last session in a conference is that, especially in a good conference, is that at least I get very insecure about my own presentation because I've seen so much good presentation earlier that kind of refutes my arguments and so on and so on. But I will try. So my theme is about, or my case is Norway, where I live. I live in Oslo. And there's been a lot of discussions going on the last years about denial. And it's been very popular at this conference this year as well. And a section of this denial literature in Norway has been concentrated around this concept of petroguilt, which I'm not necessarily going to critique it, but I'm going to complement it and complicate it. And I do this by the term Petronoia, which I will hopefully have time to define after a while. So I will just start by briefly sketching out Norway. So Norway discovered oil in 1969. It was a Texan, Phillips Petroleum, who did that. And due to a lot of circumstances, among other social democracy, Norway has been able to sort of become a successful petrostate, where the state has been able to tax heavily the petroleum industry, and it has created its own public enterprise, previously called Statoil, now Equinor. Equinor sounds like for equality and the rest of it. And you can see there's much greenwashing going on here. But actually, what I'm trying to do is to go beyond the greenwashing critique, okay? So one of the successes isn't only like a state enterprise, but it's also like the state has been able to receive a lot of money. This is, among other things, going into a sovereign wealth fund. A horrible project in terms of where it invests. It has invested in Israel, among other places, and it's been highly criticized lately. But it's a way, nonetheless, of how the wealth is sort of shared by the Norwegian population. So this is another way of like framing how the petroleum economy is actually the Norwegian political economy. They are more or less the same. So the petroleum economy is very large. It's a large share of the GDP. It's an extremely large share of the exports of Norway. This number goes a bit up and down, but it's been fairly stable at around 50%. And it's a lot of the state's revenues. This is partly regulated through the fund. All the revenues of the state goes into this fund, and the state is only allowed to use 4% of the fund in its state budget. But nonetheless, this is 4% of that fund is extremely much money. Okay, so here's the petroguilt literature that I want to engage with. It's originating in the environmental humanities. So it's particularly this book by Kari Marie Norgård that is sort of the origin of like the denial literature in Norway, I would say, which is like an ethnography of Norway. So she's describing Bygdaby. It's like a fictional town, but or not a fictional, but an anonymous town, where that was relying on snow tourism. But then in the early 2000s, there was like very warm weather, and she was like interrogating the inhabitants of Bygdaby. Bygdaby means like small city, village city, how they related to this. And she found out that there was like this social organized denial. And she found all kinds of what she calls deflection of responsibility, that people say, you know, the US is bigger, they pollute more, you know, Norway is a little country, etc. So the people she talked to didn't want to claim the responsibility of being a polluter. And this has been like further developed in a lot of work. I'm not going to go through all of this, but among other things, petroguilt has become a term. So it originates from a research project around Scanguilt, it was called, which tried to describe how the wealth of the Scandinavian resulted in this feeling of guilt and all the ways it manifested. And petroguilt is like the Norwegian version of Scanguilt. It's like the guilty awareness of being very privileged due to some not so good things, to say it easily. And a very important part of this literature is privilege. It's like the guilt comes from being privileged. That's like my reading of the literature. So I try to make a very simplified model of all of these texts. I don't know if it's extremely accurate, but it's fun to do, at least. But what I sort of find is that privilege is like a master signifier, and it leads to like a trinity of responsibility. The privileges you have comes with some sort of responsibility, and when you don't follow up on those responsibility, you have a guilty feeling. And this guilty feeling is sort of sought to be avoided through different means of denial. For instance, by saying Norway is a little country. But it's sometimes it's always the return of the oppressed, right? If you're familiar with psychoanalytic vocabulary, so this takes all kinds of forms. So Ellen Rees, behind the paper all to the right there, the Petro guilt, she describes how Norwegians on an unconscious plane is feeling very guilty, but on a conscious plane, and this is like the return of the press, it comes out as a very innocence. Norway is actually kind of pure. We have a green sovereign wealth fund, and we are very nature loving, etc. And I find like implicitly in this framework, it's never mentioned in the literature. That's why it's a gray arrow. There's like, okay, you have privilege. This leads to responsibility, and then you might feel some guilt. And when you're feeling this guilt, it should follow that you have some moral action. I feel that that's like implied in this literature, but it never happens, right? Norwegians never act on their morality or their feeling of guilt. So now I'm going just to show where this literature has sort of like made this analysis, and it's usually based in either ethnography, as Nurgaard did, or in more a cultural analysis sense. So Julia Leida, she, in a very beautiful way, described a belated oil boom in Norwegian screen culture, coming about 50 years after the discovery of oil in the Norwegian waters. And this happened in 2015. So even if there could have been like a oil unconscious before that, to paraphrase Mark Bold's great analysis, for instance, in Knausgård, that Bold refers to, that Knausgård isn't actively talking about the climate change, but it nonetheless comes up in an unconscious plane. Leida is very correct that since the 2015, there's like a whole of literature and fiction that has like directly thematicized petroleum. It varies very greatly to the extent that this is treating climate change as such. For instance, State of Happiness never deals with the climate change. It's only about the discovery of oil in the 1960s and 70s. But oil has certainly become a very important part of culture. And what I'm particularly interested in is this series, which was very popular. It was the most expensive series made in Norway at its time of production. And it exported to a lot of countries. So it was also interesting. I think this is the Italian version, in DVD even. And it's called Occupied. And the plot is that what happens if you stop oil production? Okay? And what I find interesting with this series is that it, for instance, differs from State of Happiness. Because State of Happiness is about petroleum in the past, right? So Julia Leida, for instance, she has argued that this is a form where Norwegians can enjoy petroleum through the eyes of the innocent people in the 60s, which is a brilliant analysis, I think. But Occupied is closer to the present, right? It's in the near future, right? It also differs, Occupied differs from another very good book, I think, speculative fiction. If I were to translate it, like the Sea Rowing of Paul Abel, which is about after the oil. So there's been like, okay, Norway stopped with oil because of all kinds of reasons. And in like the poor aftermath, there came a eco-fascist government. And this book is like a thematization of this eco-fascist government, okay? But that's like way in the future. And it also differs from a very interesting season of Borgen, a Danish series, which is about like the fictional discovery of an oil field in Denmark. The size, they say, of Norway's most famous oil field, Ekofisk, which is, you see, way down there, exactly out of Denmark's lines. Yeah, I'm not going to go into there, but there we were discussing it before the panel, that in Denmark there's this saying that there was this drunk bureaucrat that set the line wrong, right? But it's not true, but it's a good story. So Borgen is about like what happens if Denmark finds Ekofisk, and they, good moral people as they are, they just leave it in the ground. Okay, but Borgen is about this prime minister, Jesper Berg, who has his governmental office in what is in reality is Equinor's international headquarters, which is funny, placed in Oslo. And it's about like what happens if he, a green prime minister, stops all the export of Norwegian petroleum through these pipelines. I think like 30% of European energy comes from these pipelines from Norway. Okay. So what I particularly find interesting in this series, and I must just start by saying that the Petroguilt literature has been interested in this series as well. They have read it as like a ideological whale hiding Norwegian responsibility. Because in this, let me come back to that, their analysis. But my analysis is this. In the first episode, Jesper Berg, the newly elected prime minister, invites international and national journalists to this thorium nuclear plant, which is, it doesn't exist actually. This is and this is very funny because a very good, my only childhood Marxist friend, he's actually from a farm in that little cluster there, and their farm is exactly where the nuclear plant is. But that's another story. So he invites the journalists there, and then he says, the oil age is over. Norway is stopping its export, but we have thorium. Thorium is like a, I think it was named by a priest very close to this town actually, who found it, and he named it after the Norse god Thor. But thorium is not efficient today as an energy means of energy. But in this series, it's kind of solved. So that you already had this nuclear plant, and he promises to export energy to Europe. All right. But what happens? Immediately after Berg has this speech, he's kidnapped by Russian elite soldiers. They come with a helicopter and sort of forces him to restart the extraction of oil. And in the helicopter, they show him this iPad, and it turns out that it's the European Union who has hired Russia to do this because we need the oil. Sorry, Berg, we need the oil. So like the Petroguilt reading of this is that Norway is saying like, it's not us, it's Europe. They need our oil, so we just have to do it. And it's a good analysis, but I want to challenge it or complicate it by this. It's very difficult not to see Berg as like a doppelganger of a previous prime minister, Jens Stoltenberg, who has also been the general secretary of NATO, and who just returned and became the minister of finance now. And in a very infamous speech in 2006, he said, in 7 years, we will have our Norwegian moon landing. We will install carbon capture technology at this large combined gas station at Mongstad. This moon landing never happened, right? And it's a trauma in Norway. It didn't happen for several reasons, but the thing I draw out of this is that the moon crash landing, as an environmental activist called it, is like a trauma in Norway that is always thematicized every time somebody tried to raise a desire for planning. So it's like, it's impossible to plan because you will just have a moon crash landing, all right? And yeah, I don't want to go too much into this, but there are striking similarities in how they behave, Jens Stoltenberg and Jesper Berg, and their looks, and their name, of course. But yeah, so the interesting thing about like why planning in a neoliberal age doesn't work, he tried, but it didn't work, is usually described by a framework that Jens Stoltenberg usually uses. He's an economist who is very skeptical about the possibility of planning. And he's often talking about Norway as a small open economy. Denmark is too, of course. And the idea is that small open just means that you have high levels of import and export. And small means that it's very difficult to kind of, as one neoliberal economist calls it, like to affect the outer world. So it's better to just reflect the world market rather than trying to challenge it. So this is actually another paper I'm working on, but this is how like I believe the Norwegian Ministry of Finance thinks about the green transition. It's too expensive for Norway to do it, and it's impossible to pick green winners, etc. So we rather need to wait for the world market to develop cheap technology, etc., that will come to Norway, and then we can implement it, and it will be a green society. All right. And this line of thinking is very preoccupied by unintended consequences. I mean, all neoclassical economists are. So it's very difficult to do something because something else will do. And I think this is like the plot of Occupied, actually. It's like you try to have a green politics, and then you end up by basically being Jesper Berg. He ends up being like a Norwegian that's wrong. He's not a Norwegian Quisling, because Quisling was Norwegian. He's a green Quislinger, because he actually ends up cooperating with the Russians, and then he tries to fight against them, and so on. It goes back and forth. It's an interesting series. You should see it. But I think it has this as like it's unconscious, that it's something dangerous with planning in a neoliberal context. And I think rather than sort of just read this as ideology, I think we should rather accept it as a condition in capitalism, that it is difficult to plan, right? So I think David Harvey has this brilliant phrase in a paper from 1972 where he says that rather than proving that the neoclassical economist theories are wrong, you should rather ask, why are they true? You should challenge the conditions that make them true. All right. But this leads to a very anxious feeling in Occupied, I would say. It's a very anxious thriller. And this form of anxiety, the economic historian Ola Inseth has described very well, I think. Like, petroleum is in itself very volatile in the market, so it goes up and down. This creates a lot of anxiety in Norway, I think. And it's also like highly like unsecure. What will happen when the wells run dry? And what will happen if we try to go away from petroleum? So there's like a lot of things that makes petroleum giving rise to this anxious feeling in Norway, I think. And Dutch disease is certainly one of it. I'm not going to go too far into that, but it means that petrostates usually have this tendency to develop the extractive industry at the expense of other exporting industries, all right? And I found this term Petronoia by reading Tom Clausa, who's like an oil analyst, financial analyst. And he uses this term to describe some tendencies in the financial markets, where a lack of petroleum creates like a dynamic where investors desperately try to buy petroleum, and then the prices go up, and it kind of goes to a bubble, right? And this happens, I think he says it on a yearly basis, basically. But I understand Petronoia not as, how are you doing on time?
1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, great. It's not only about like the fear of the lack of oil, I think, although that's a very important aspect of Petronoia Norway. I might do some more research on that later, but this is a very common phrase in Norway. If we don't extract, somebody else will do it. It's like this paranoid feeling that somebody's after our oil, as it were. But I'm more interested in the Petronoia of like this question, which is very often raised in the media. From what should we live on after oil? And this is a difficult question if you know it's difficult to plan in a neoliberal economy. And I think this question, which rarely appears in the environmental humanities, allows us to develop another model than the one I showed with the petroguilt. So I think like a political economy approach to this dynamic is that you have these inhuman structures, like capitalism basically, who have all these unintended consequences, all kinds of things that makes planning difficult. It gives rise to this anxiety, I think, which Occupied kind of thematicizes, and which this question certainly do. And this anxiety can be, again, denied. The inhuman structures like capitalism can be directly denied, but it can also give rise to anxiety, which again can be denied. And then you can have all kinds of detours there. Jesper Berg first cooperates with the Russians, and then he don't, and so on. There are many things that happen there. But I think this model kind of opens up for another path than the moral action that I showed in the first diagram, and that is collective action. And I think that's Occupied kind of, it's not a communist series, but it kind of shows that to alter this, you actually has to, in Occupied's sense, violently resist fossil capital, actually. I don't have time to this. I think I will just really end it, not by this great quote by Engels, but by another quote by Jody Dean that I really like. So I think when you're denying capitalism, you're also sort of denying communism as a solution to this. And I think this is another conclusion and a moral conclusion in the first set of literature. But I think I'll end it with that, all right? Thank you.
Hey, hello everybody. Can you hear me okay? Cool. My name is Benjamin Stumpf. I'm coming from Connecticut, and I'm finishing my PhD in political theory. This is not exactly the abstract that you might have read, but it is the same project. So I'm very excited to share this research with you. Just quickly, by a show of hands, have folks heard of the Stop Cop City movement or the struggle against Cop City? Okay, cool. Right on. So, partisans of the movement here, perhaps? Excellent. So, yeah, the title of this is Policing the Climate, Cop Cities and Resistance in the Age of Ecological Crisis. Some of you may catch the reference to Stuart Hall's classics and his grad students, Policing the Crisis. And we can talk a little bit about conjunctural analysis and what I'm doing in the Q&A. I'll cover that a little bit in the presentation. But let's begin. So Cop City, Stop Cop City, has emerged as a central demand of a small but resurgent US left. Since 2021, in the aftermath of the 2020 George Floyd rebellion, the demand has spread across various corners of US radical social movements, animating protests, political education, coalition building, and otherwise, specifically at the intersection of anti-carceral abolitionist struggles and environmental justice. So here's some examples. This is Stop Cop City Solidarity in New York City. Here is one of my favorite groups within the movement, the Elders, the Rocking Chair Rebellion. Elders say Stop Cop City. And here's from my own context in Connecticut, the Stop Cop City Connecticut Solidarity Coalition. So Stop Cop City everywhere. But what does that mean? We should speak about the spread of the slogan because it invokes the necessity of understanding actually what is meant by this term Cop City. So Cop City is obviously a problem, but what kind of problem is it? And this is where my research is trying to make the intervention in taking this social movement theorization and kind of expanding it a little bit and digging deeper. So my project seeks to historically and theoretically enrich our conceptualization of this Cop City problem such that we might nourish more effective resistance in an age of colliding crises of policing, climate change, imperialism, state power, pandemic, etc. So what is Cop City? So the term comes from the struggle in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a major city in the US South. Atlanta is the capital of the state of Georgia. And in 2021, Atlanta-based activists became aware of a coalition of state, corporate, and nonprofit entities that were pushing forward plans to destroy over 300 acres of the South River Forest to build a state-of-the-art police training compound. So this would be titled the Public Safety Training Center, and it would be fitted with a mock city for police to practice protest suppression and other urban counterinsurgency tactics. So that's where this name, Cop City, comes from, is these plans to have, they had a bar, they had a city, they had some streets for police to practice kettling and deployment of tear gas and other kinds of nasty nasty work. So activists named the project Cop City and also began to organize to defend the forest. So here is in the original plans. You can see lots of different things going on here. I just want to point out that there was, in the initial plans, the Michelle Obama Park, as well as it was originally going to be titled the Public Safety and Social Justice Training Center, because it really is making an intervention at this post-2020 moment where there's people talk about this racial reckoning and things like that. But this is very clearly an urban police militarization compound that also evokes a range of different climate justice issues. Not only would this destroy one of Atlanta's largest green spaces, a place where tons of plants and animals live, as well as human beings like to enjoy nature, but so that would be environmentally destructive in and of itself. But the point that I kind of want to further is that Cop City has another environmental justice implication, which is that the police training and other kinds of carceral work that would happen there would be deployed against the climate justice movement. So, and that maybe seems like kind of a leap, but that's the argument that the movement makes and that we can build on here. So what we should understand is that the Atlanta Police Foundation, this is a nonprofit that exists in Atlanta, they are funding corporate dollars from companies such as Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Delta Airlines, Amazon, through which allows the Atlanta Police Department to get millions of dollars beyond what they're allocated in the city budget, which is already the lion's share of the city budget. But this nonprofit police foundation funnels corporate donations to it, and this is like a public-private kind of alliance. So the project was backed by the city government in Atlanta, which is controlled by the Democrats, as well as through recently released Freedom of Information Act documents, being closely supported by the Biden administration in its initial planning, as well as the Republican governors of the state of Georgia. So it's a real happy, bipartisan kind of collaboration here. But the argument that I want to make is that this term Cop City refers to more than the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. And there's a few reasons that that's my argument. The first is that Atlanta's PSTC promises to train police forces from around the United States as well as security forces from around the world. So this actual physical location in Atlanta would circulate law enforcement officers from across the country, but also allied security forces. I think particularly what exists is the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, which is a partnership between Atlanta Police Department and the IDF. In fact, actually, the plans for Cop City are drawn initially from an IDF training camp on the outskirts of Gaza that they call Little Gaza. So this kind of urban recreation where security forces go and train speaks to a kind of global counterinsurgency circulation. But also, so we also understand that these political and economic forces supporting the project include national and transnational actors, Georgia state government, federal government, both capitalist parties, and transnational corporations, like I said, like Coca-Cola. As well, there are also similar police expansion projects that are cropping up across the United States. This was compiled by activists who have started to show the spread of this term Cop City to explain different police expansion, police militarization developments across the country. There's about 63 here. They're not all to the same extent as Atlanta's, but they all kind of speak to, this is all post 2020. So they all speak to this post 2020 rebellion expansion of policing that we can maybe capture by this term, Cop City. So here just is an example of some of the funding arms of these projects. So we have these police foundations, these nonprofits in the center that supply the money to local police departments, but we see various industries kind of supporting these. So we have big tech, Wall Street, retail, and fossil fuels particularly. So the point then is that Cop City refers to more than the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. It's something that we have to kind of expand our scope if we want to understand. But I would also say that it means more than this term police militarization, which if folks are interested, we could talk about why I find police militarization to be unsatisfactory afterwards. But the main point is that saying, okay, well, it's more than the Public Safety Training Center. What it is this post-2020 wave of police militarization. That runs the risk of historically flattening what's actually happening because what we need is an analysis that can provide something historically specific. Why now? Why in this form? And how? Police militarization is kind of a vague and rather liberal concept in my understanding. So here's two familiar, perhaps, and friendly faces. I would argue that the way to open up this question of Cop City, we can turn to the tradition of conjunctural analysis in the work of Antonio Gramsci and Stuart Hall. And there's several reasons for this. I think that they're very good, but this is also coming from the movement. There are study groups that were studying Stuart Hall inside of the Weelaunee Forest, the South River Forest, that they were occupying to kind of understand what was going on. So this conjunctural analysis comes out of Stuart Hall's reading of Gramsci, and it offers an analysis of the historical conjuncture, historically specific political situations where political, economic, and cultural forces come together to give a precise moment in the life of a society its distinctive shape. So what we do in conjunctural analysis is move from the abstract to the concrete. We distinguish between what is organic and what is conjunctural, and the difference there is what are the objective historical features that we are all embedded in, and then the conjuncture, I would argue, means what is the space of action that we have, what are the day-to-day ways where we can make interventions. Now that might be a bit of a provocative understanding of conjuncture, but we can maybe talk about that later. So the value of conjunctural analysis is that it is always attuned to the kind of shifting, moving, and changing nature of political events, as well as the ways where actual historical and concrete reality departs from our theories, and that's kind of what we look for. But when we speak about the conjuncture, we're speaking about what is the immediate terrain of struggle. That's Stuart Hall's definition. So in other words, how can we develop a strategic and partisan view of a concrete political situation such that we might make an effective intervention? And that's what really gives this method its political teeth. So then my argument that I come to is that the term then Cop City can compellingly describe the nationwide expansion of policing as a political response to a sharpening crisis of US state authority, and that this crisis of US state authority is wrought by at least these three factors, which I would clarify as deepening inequality, growing and expanding rebellion, and the social and ecological fallout of climate change. Kind of going a bit deeper there. My argument is that Cop City opens a window into understanding the current conjuncture of US politics, characterized by what I would say is the exhaustion of the neoliberal settlement, meaning that there is a sharpening crisis of authority, and that is taking hold over the past, say, decade or so. The neoliberal settlement, I would define as the social, political, and economic cultural order that won out amid the crisis of the post-war order in the 1960s and 70s, resolving and settling turbulent social times on decidingly ruling class and pro-capitalist counter-revolutionary terms, holding explosive contradictions together for a time. So today, however, I argue that this settlement, this kind of political bloc that was installed in the resolution of the crisis of the 1960s and 70s is beginning to come apart at the seams, and morbid symptoms ensue. So there, like I said, are at least three relevant historical forces putting negative pressure on the neoliberal settlement. That's growing inequality, expanding rebellion, and climate change. So we could think about these a little bit more concretely. We can trace a kind of sharpening of economic inequality in the United States through the 2008 financial crisis, the rapid expansion of homelessness, but then I also think that the COVID-19 pandemic really laid bare a lot of these, how desperate the situation had gotten. Neoliberal inequality thus manifests as a collapse as the conditions of social reproduction and the ability for people to make and remake their daily lives on a sharpening basis, particularly. So we can think about this in this way. We can think about the rapid expansion of urban homelessness and urban poverty over the neoliberal period. But the other pressure that is kind of dissolving and exhausting the neoliberal settlement is an expanding geography of militant rebellion in the United States, which we could trace from Occupy Wall Street to the Black Lives Matter movement to Standing Rock to 2020. Now, I'm sure all of us, good, serious communists here might have all of our critiques of these movements and their liberalisms or whatever, but what it does really register is the exhaustion of the hegemony of neoliberalism and a real demand for an alternative that is emerging. So more and more, in other words, more and more people are finding it more and more sensible to work towards transformative social change. as maybe a minimum argument. So this is, these are the protests that occurred in the summer of 2020 in the United States. This was the largest protest movement in the history of the United States in terms of per capita numbers. And I think that that is rather relevant. We can also think about the militant phase of the rebellion, which was about several weeks in May and June. This is the taking of the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis, where George Floyd rebels were able to capture and burn down the police department in the city of Minneapolis, where the police department murdered George Floyd. This, and this was actually spoken about in Dennis's presentation earlier, but when this happened, 54% in some public poll of Americans said, we support the burning down of the police station here. Now that is probably wildly different now, partly because of the kind of Cop City project as I'll describe, but I think it does speak to this crisis of ruling hegemony that sharpens in 2020. We can also think about the attack on media outlets. So this is the CNN headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. This is in the protests of 2020, and they're protesting against the misrepresentation of what the George Floyd rebels were demanding in their anti-police struggle. But then there's also this other pressure of climate change, or what I would kind of clarify as an expanding geography of ecological collapse. So we live today in a period increasingly defined by rising global temperatures, extreme weather, wildfires, flooding, mass extinction, and other ecological phenomenon driven by contemporary climate change. And my argument, and we might agree, is that climate change is driven by capitalist social relations that rely on the endless extraction of life from human beings and land in order to support the endless accumulation of capital. So this kind of endless drive for extraction exhausts people and the natural world, leading to an expanding geography of ecological collapse. And ecological collapse therefore poses a 3rd distinct political problem for the US state, which functions or attempts to function to reproduce and enforce the social and ecological relations that drive contemporary climate change. So climate change becomes a real nut for capitalist states to try to solve because they exist to reproduce the conditions that drive it. This is flooding in Atlanta, Georgia over the past several years, and these are wildfires in my home of California over 2025. So the point of this expanding geography of ecological collapse as defining climate change speaks to just the growing inability for people to deny climate change. In other words, it's in your face, it's burning down your home, especially in the first world or in the United States. There's more and more evidence of climate change that is being experienced. And this, to put it in the Gramscian terms, is registering as a crisis of US hegemony. So inequality, rebellion, and climate change are at least three of the social and historical forces that are eroding the neoliberal settlement and exhausting consent to the status quo of power. And this organic crisis of US capitalism in the age of climate change is producing what Gramsci termed a general crisis of the state, or a crisis of hegemony. So in a period of hegemonic rule, according to Gramsci, power is reproduced by a combination of consent and coercion. A crisis of hegemony thus occurs when popular consent begins to fail. So a crisis of authority is thus in a crisis of authority and leadership. So he writes, and this is just Gramsci's words on this from the prison notebooks, it's when huge masses have passed suddenly from a state of political passivity to a certain activity. So this registers in 2020, but also the previous decade. We talk about this age of protests and such over the 2010s. So kind of reformulated, my argument is that Cop City is a political response to the crisis of US hegemony that takes the form of a nationwide expansion of policing. Now, this argument makes sense, remember, when we expand Cop City to mean more than the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center and something more historically grounded than this term of police militarization. It, in other words, is a political response. So when we turn to Stuart Hall, Hall writes that a crisis of hegemony marks a moment of profound rupture, an accumulation of contradictions, when the basis of political leadership and cultural authority becomes exposed and contested. And we can really think about, the spirit of 2020 and the taking of the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis, or the spread of those protests as a moment where this hegemony began to rupture. Stuart Hall then argues that in such a moment, old forces run through their repertoires of domination. Okay, wrap it up. So it's the coming of iron times. So we can think then about Cop City as a mode of coercive power, but kind of going quickly, my argument is that it is more than that. Cop City is an ideological project. We can think about it more than just police militarization. We have these anti-protest bills funded by the fossil fuel industry for the most part. These are all post-2020. So we can think about Cop City then as a hegemonic project. It's not just an attempt to expand police so they can beat up more people or lock up more people. It's an attempt to rewrite a basis for consent for the state. It's an ideological project. We can see this in the construction of the crime wave that justified it. But the point then is, and if folks have followed the movement, here's my intervention, that we can't fight Cop City in just the Weelaunee Forest. There's an anarchist trend, for the most part, in the Stop Cop City movement, where folks want to chain themselves to trees and physically stop the construction of these training centers. And I would never punch left, especially among friends, but my argument is that we need to think about where the struggle is happening in culture and in ideas, and the fact that Cop City is about winning hearts and minds over. So we need a different kind of strategy, perhaps a one that takes seriously the construction of a majority in a project of building hegemony. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben, and also Alf, for two excellent presentations. I'm going to just sit here, and I don't have any slides, so maybe we just turn this off. Okay, so just want to preface this by saying that I usually think I kind of over-prepare for presentations, and this time I think maybe I've under-prepared a little bit, but that's because what I'm going to say and talk about is something that's very much work in progress, and so I'm hoping to get some interesting feedback, reading suggestions, theoretical ways of thinking about some of these issues from all of you in the conversation. So I want to say something about climate politics often for the far right and the kinds of potentially contradictions or at least challenges that confront the far right in relation to climate, and by extension what therefore will confront all of us insofar as we have to deal with the far right. So the basic kind of starting point for what I want to say is that I think we can think of the far right's climate politics as a laboratory. So the far right, in as far as we can think of it as a coherent and self-contained thing or phenomenon, which I don't really think we can, but just for sort of analytic convenience, I'm going to do that. And when I talk about the far right, I'm specifically talking about the far right in Europe, but very much welcome comments from comrades, especially I guess there's quite a few people interested in the US, the extent to which this might extend there and other parts of the world as well. But the kind of basic motivation is, I think what we've seen on migration policy is a diffusion of far right ideas and policies from the far right to essentially most of the political spectrum, in some countries all the way actually to the left, but in most countries maybe sort of to the stopping just short of the most left-wing parties. And I think a similar thing might be happening on climate. So I think that actually what the far right is doing on climate now might be what well, I'm going to tell you in a second why the right is already doing it, and what I think the center and the center-left might very soon be coming to be doing as well. And that's why I think we need to grapple with this question. So the way I go about thinking about this is in a relational and maybe even dialectical way. So I don't think that the far right, again, with the caveat that it isn't one coherent thing, has only one way of thinking about this issue. There are internal tensions and disagreements within the far right in how they should think about climate. And by climate, I also mean energy and approach to fossil fuels and all the rest of it. So sort of expansive understanding of climate. And that they move between forms of denialism, delay, and nationalism in particular. And it isn't really a sort of a progression so that the far right used to all be denialists and then they became delayers and now they're all nationalists. But I do think there is a tendency you can see in multiple European countries, certainly the ones that I have studied. So I'm particularly interested in Denmark, Sweden, and the UK. A move gradually from denialism via delay to nationalism. And again, this isn't a unidirectional thing, because these all interact, and they in some ways can also reinforce each other. And there's obviously a high degree on the far right of opportunism as well, rather than just principle, right? I mean, the far right, maybe par excellence, is the kind of political wing of opportunism here. And I think that essentially the far right is attempting to, and I have a kind of Gramscian way of thinking about some of these issues as well, like Ben had about Cop City, thinking about the far right attempting to engage in a struggle over the common sense, producing the common sense around climate, and ultimately, obviously, a struggle around hegemony to try and displace the paradigm of kind of pro-climate, like sort of liberal pro-climate green growth paradigms, and replace it with something else. Obviously, they're also against eco-socialism, but insofar as eco-socialism, unfortunately and tragically, is not a major electoral threat to the far right now, I would wager that they're less concerned with this at the moment. But that will change in the future, obviously. And so the indication that these kinds of ideas and politics are moving from the far right, diffusing from the far right elsewhere, I think we can see in a recent statement made by Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor in the German Bundestag, where he said, I have the longer quote here, he said, and so, yeah, if anyone doesn't know, I mean, Friedrich Merz is a right-wing politician, but isn't on the far right. You know, he's not in the AfD. He said, and this is a quote, "Germany makes up about 1% of the world's population and accounts for about 2% of the problem when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. Even if all of us here in Germany were to become climate neutral tomorrow, not a single natural disaster anywhere in the world would occur less frequently. Not a single forest fire would happen less often. Not a single flood in Texas would be prevented." I mean, this is just obviously, patently, factually incorrect, first of all, and shows a total disregard for even the most simple, basic, totally uncontroversial, established natural scientific facts of how climate change actually operates, because it is just not true that Germany's emissions have no bearing on global climate. They very much have a very direct bearing on this. And there's lots of recent natural scientific research that shows this in what's called attribution science by people like Friederike Otto and others, especially at Imperial College in London, who are trying to show the direct relationship between fossil, like carbon majors, fossil fuel corporations, and also the most heavily polluting states, and specific types of extreme weather events, etc. So it absolutely is not the case that if Germany went net zero tomorrow, that there wouldn't be any fewer extreme weather events. There very much would. So this shows how this, I think this is essentially, it's a far-right discourse that has been adopted by the right, and that I think we have seen far from the end of that in terms of the diffusion of it. So the way I think about the far right's approach to climate, beyond this idea of denialism, delay, and nationalism, is that essentially there are two different kinds of paths that we can note, certainly in the countries that I've been focusing on. So I would say that there's the kind of techno-optimist redistributivism, as I call it, and I think the redistributivism is by and large bullshit, basically. So they claim to be redistributive. They claim to have some, it's not class politics for them, but some semblance of redistribution, or like a materialist commitment to not making like the so-called green transition exacerbate inequalities. But it's a fundamental belief and commitment to the idea of techno-optimism. This mostly plays out in relation to nuclear energy. So a kind of a savior status of nuclear energy as the singular technological fix that will essentially mean that we can free ourselves from Saudi oil and Russian gas, the despotic, dictatorial, barbaric dependence on these countries, non-European countries, and instead without capitulating to the renewable energy industry and the delusional green capitalists. I mean, they are delusional, but for different reasons. Nuclear will save us all because we get rid of emissions, but we also don't have to capitulate to the energy, to the wind and solar lobby, and crucially, we also don't have to capitulate to China. So that's one side of the equation, and this is very much what's being pursued in Sweden by the Sweden Democrats. So I've written about this recently. The central role of a kind of redistributive approach to this issue, in which actually the far right often can outflank even the center left on climate, right? So you have subsidies for electric vehicles, you have subsidies for heat pumps, which are upward wealth transfers. I mean, these are subsidies for the rich by and large at the expense of the working class. And so working class resentment builds. Also, there's a very major urban-rural divide in which rural working class communities feel totally left behind in the sense, and that it feels like it's a transfer from the rural to the urban and from the working class to the rest of society. But then you have the other approach, which is what you see more in the UK, although of course these are also not entirely kind of severed, which is anti-net zero politics, which is the framing of it in the UK, which I think is a kind of anti-politics actually. So it's a way of, rather than trying, so in Sweden what's happening is the far right trying to politicize climate. So if you think of how the far right was thinking about climate certainly in the 90s, it was very much just outright either denialism, right? So climate change isn't real, or it was just a kind of shrug of the shoulders of whatever, it doesn't matter if it's real or not, we don't really care about it, and we're not going to deal with it because that's something that kind of soft leftists care about, and tree huggers or whatever. And the far right is about anti-migration, it's about securing the borders, it's about kicking out immigrants, etc., etc. That's very much changed. So the far right in Sweden, for example, have realized, so I argue in my work on this, is they realized that actually climate is a vote winner, right? So they realized that after the surge of the climate movement around 2018, 2019, that lots of people care about climate, even people on the far right, even people who vote for the far right care about climate. It isn't just some fringe issue. Well, it certainly wasn't at the time. It might be becoming that more and more again, but lots of people care about climate. So the real issue is that we should, by we, I mean in this case the far right, we should actually try and contest the fact that the left have been hegemonic on the production of common sense on this issue, and we should provide an alternative, a rival vision of this, instead of just ignoring it. Because by ignoring it, we can see all the other political parties are gradually making concessions to kind of green social movements, and it seems like they're being rewarded by it, and we're falling behind by not doing that. So we should also do it. Okay, so in terms of the climate nationalism, I just want to say one thing quickly before moving to saying something specific about the UK. A central part of how the far right thinks about this, I think, again mirrors the issue of migration, which is the technique of, we could call it outsourcing, and I mean that kind of broadly speaking or loosely speaking. So if you think of, on the migration issue, the extreme lengths that the far right, and by extension the diffusion of that into other kind of establishment parties, the extreme lengths they've gone to try and externalize the issue, right? So think about Rwanda. I mean, so the UK government's attempt to essentially offshore their so-called migration problem to Rwanda was invented by the Danish Social Democrats, actually, which is a shamefully, I'm from Denmark, and the Social Democrats shamefully have become a model for lots of center-left and actually center-right parties across Europe as the way to crack the code of fending off the far right, which I think is absolutely untrue and also massive political capitulation. But on migration, there's been this extreme attempt to outsource the problem, right? Australia is another good example of this, of actually having offshore, offshore processing of asylum claims, etc. And a similar thing is happening on the climate issue. So the far right, I think, has realized that our climate nationalism has an international dimension. So they're not internationalists, obviously, but it has an international dimension in the sense that we can sort of fix this issue by transplanting the problem elsewhere. So the Sweden Democrats, also the Danish far right, Reform UK, in this country and in many other countries, the far right is saying, look, it's pointless for us to fight the climate crisis and to reduce emissions at home. It's very expensive. You have this as well in Norway, this idea that like, oh, well, but, it's going to be very expensive for us to do a so-called green transition in Norway because, everything's very expensive here. And look, like we could just subsidize the Bangladeshi government to do something instead. We'll get way more bang for the buck. So there's just, and that is used obviously cynically as a way to not do anything at home. So it's a form of delay. Rather than denialism, it's saying, okay, well, fine if something has to be done about emissions, but we're not going to do it here. We're going to do it elsewhere. And we might actually even be willing to subsidize some of that, right? So similarly to how, as the war in Syria was raging, the far right across most of Europe was pleading for Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, especially to, that essentially, refugees should be settled in the neighboring countries is the discourse that was used, because we don't want to be confronted with this problem in Europe. And a similar thing is happening on climate, which I think is very important here. So the idea is that the issue is China. China needs to reduce their emissions, notwithstanding that, on a consumption measure, actually, most of China's emissions are actually Europe's emissions as well. But that the problem is in China, the problems in India, in Bangladesh, in Southeast Asia, and that it's pointless for us to do anything here. It's too expensive, and the working class will, the working class will suffer because they're paying the price for a problem that they did not create. So this is on the level of mitigation, but if we look at the level of adaptation, I think an interesting phenomenon is occurring as well. And if we turn then to the UK to look at the issue of adaptation, I don't know if anyone was at this presentation on Thursday by Harry on reform and flood adaptation. It turned out that Harry gave exactly the presentation that I was planning on giving today, which is why I'm kind of freewheeling now, because I didn't want to just bore people who were at that panel with doing literally word for word the same thing. But I guess it's nice to be vindicated that it seemed like at least there was one other person who thought that this was something interesting, and also we had a similar way of thinking about it. But I'll finish off by giving the example of how reform is dealing with floods and flood adaptation in the UK. So in September of this year, a report by Aviva, which is Britain's largest insurance company, essentially largest general insurance company, they painted a very stark picture of the future of climate in the UK. So at the moment, 6.3 million properties in England alone are at risk of flooding, and by 2050, this number is going to increase by 25% to 8 million properties, which is a quarter of all UK homes that are going to be at, and this is like at risk, means like at serious risk. So there's a kind of quantification of that, but essentially a quarter of all UK homes are going to be at severe risk of flooding by 2050. Now, insurance companies are obviously freaking out about this because in a way this could mean that they could make loads of money, but it increases the risk and the volatility and the anxiety as well. Similarly to the oil industry and the volatility of oil prices, it massively raises the liabilities of these insurance companies. And recently, the first town in the UK declared that their publicly owned buildings are now officially uninsurable, i.e. they can't find an insurance company that will insure the buildings, regardless of the price. The insurance companies are just like, we're pulling out. This is too high risk for us to get involved in. So they don't even think they can make any money from this aspect of the climate crisis. That town, by the way, swung from the Tories to Reform in the most recent election. And the interesting thing is that out of the 10 most flood-prone constituencies in the UK, 8 of them are looking to be landslide Reform wins in the next general election. And even more interestingly, the most flood-prone constituency in the UK by far, Boston and Skegness, is the home constituency of Richard Tice, who is, essentially the leader of the right wing of the Reform Party in this country. And so you have this interesting situation where the most vulnerable areas in the UK to certain types of extreme weather events, which, very soon won't be extreme anymore, but might be commonplace, such as flooding, are actually some of the heartlands of the Reform Party as well. So what does this mean? Well, it's likely that there will be a series of rapidly escalating extreme weather events in these heartlands of the far right in the UK. And there's this pernicious combination of saying we don't believe in emissions reductions domestically, but that also Reform seem very hesitant to be spending any public money on adaptation, right? So they have declared, Richard Tice, who I mentioned before, has dismissed the madness of net stupid zero. He's calling net stupid zero, which is actually kind of catchy, but and he said he declared war on Ed Miliband, the UK's climate minister, as eco-zealots, who are here to distract from the real issues of bringing down energy prices, which are caused by this obsession with renewable energy. And so it might be that in the very near future, the slogan of the far right, "Stop the boats," comes to mean something very different, because this might be when more land is underwater. It might actually be that it's the Reform voters, right, in these flood-prone constituencies who will be demanding the boats to jump onto. So I'll just finish off by saying I think this presents interesting tensions and contradictions and challenges for the far right and how they approach the issue of both mitigation and especially adaptation, because you would think that they would recognize the need for adaptation measures, right? Extreme adaptation, actually quite ambitious adaptation measures in order to protect their constituents, essentially. But at the same time, they rely on the escalating climate crisis and the failure of the status quo and the failure of the establishment to have done anything to preventing it for them to grow, right? Part of their raison d'etre is precisely that the establishment has failed. So I think they are in an interesting kind of tension there. And you see this, I'll just finish off by saying this. The Reform recently elected mayor of Hull in the UK, part of the Midlands in the UK, which is also fairly prone to extreme weather events. Luke Campbell, a former Olympic boxer, has pushed back against the official anti-net zero position of the party by saying, I support any initiatives that will increase investment in my local area, that will create jobs, whether they're in wind or solar, I don't care, because I'm here to serve the local population. So you see these emerging rifts within the Reform Party as well, between the kind of like anti-net zero zealots and the pragmatists, the sort of pro-green growth pragmatists. And I think this is a conflict that's going to play out in the years to come. But I'll leave it there. So thank you so much.